I have been taking a course in Universal Design for Learning. Universal Design for Learning has taught me to think about my lessons in a new way. As my understanding of UDL emerges, I am becoming better at making sure my lessons maximize learning for all my students. There is this great free tool called the UDL Guidelines Checklist, especially for teachers, and I want to use it to think about one of my science lessons that hasn't worked for all my students. The goal of this lesson is that students will understand the effect of changing light on the eye. I use a textbook to teach this lesson. From what I have been learning in the UDL course, I now realize that textbooks have both strengths and challenges in presenting information. They include a lot of text and images and diagrams in a fixed representation. The strength of this is that it allows my students to refer back to the material later to reinforce what they've learned. But it also presents barriers for many of my students. For example, text requires that students can see and decode the text, be able to turn the pages, have adequate background knowledge to make sense of what they are reading, understand the language or diagrams, determine the most salient information, follow and remember the information presented, have strategies for summarizing, taking notes, and repurposing the information to meet their learning goals. In addition to using the textbook, I also lecture. Like text, I know that lectures have both strengths and challenges. Lecture is fluid and allows me to adjust to the needs of my students by adding information as necessary or speeding up if most of my students understand. I can also adjust the pitch and add energy to try to interest the students in the material. I can also add nonverbal cues that help students understand what I'm trying to present. But lectures also present barriers for many of my students. Students must be able to hear and understand what I'm saying. They must have adequate background knowledge to make sense of the information, remember what I'm saying, attend to the information, and find a strategy for remembering and repurposing the information that I'm providing. When I consider all of the skills required, not only to access the information contained within textbooks and lecture, but also to access the learning opportunities, it is clear how both text and lecture present barriers to some of my students. Therefore, with the help of UDL, I now realize that if my lessons primarily rely on the use of text and lectures, they will not support learning for all of my students. The UDL Guidelines Checklist is based on 3 overarching principles. Each of the principles is associated with one of the 3 brain networks: the knowledge network, formerly the recognition network, the strategic network, and the affective network. The 3 overarching principles guide educators in the development of lessons by making sure that all 3 brain networks are being supported. Multiple means of representation ensures that the knowledge networks of students is supported. Multiple means of action and expression ensure that the strategic network of students is supported. And multiple means of engagement ensure that the affective network of students is supported. Under each principle, ideas of how to support student learning are listed. For example, under multiple means of representation, the knowledge network, number 3, provide options for comprehension. I see highlight critical features, big ideas, and relationships. How can I highlight the important key ideas of this lesson beyond using text and lecturing to support my students' knowledge networks? When I searched for a way to improve this lesson, I found this example of how changing light affects the eye. I think it might benefit my students in their understanding. I will use the UDL guidelines to see whether this example supports the 3 UDL principles. First, I will think about whether it provides multiple means of representation in order to support the recognition network of all my students. In order to do that, I'm going to look back at how this works and see whether any of the guidelines are covered by the various elements. The text in this example is digital, which means that it can be read aloud by the computer for a student who is challenged by decoding or whose first language is not English. This is known as text-to-speech, or TTS, which supports number 1, options for perception, 1.3, alternatives for visual information, and therefore supports Principle 1, multiple means of representation, knowledge networks. I see that it includes an online glossary. That supports Guideline 2.1, defining vocabulary and symbols. Since this glossary includes pictures, it also supports Guideline 2.5, illustrate key concepts non-linguistically. It benefits students who might not have this vocabulary in their background knowledge. The benefit is also that the glossary is available right in the text. The student does not need to go to the back of the book. For some students, having to go to the back of the book puts them off task. Next, I see how students can use a slider to manipulate the amount of light the eye encounters so that they can see how the eye reacts to light. This demonstration is certainly more flexible than looking at a still image in the book and just reading about it. This is a great example of Guideline 2.5, illustrating key concepts non-linguistically. This feature also supports Guideline 3.4, support memory and transfer, as many students will form a visual memory of this action, and it will be easier for them to remember and transfer their knowledge than if they had just read a text with a fixed image. This is really cool. Students can not only regulate the amount of light entering the eye, but they can also pull the pupil and the iris apart from each other so they can really see that it is the iris and not the pupil that expands and contracts. What a great example of Guideline 3.4, highlighting critical features, big ideas, and relationships. This example that I found certainly has multiple means of representation for teaching the concept of how changing light affects the eye. Now I'll use the guideline checklist to see how this example provides Principle 2, multiple means of action and expression in support of student strategic networks. This example provides students with a choice of typing or recording their responses to the question. This is great. The goal is for students to understand the effect of changing light on the eye. Too many times, a student who is poor at writing cannot express what they really understand because he or she is a poor writer. Also, when I ask students to respond by oral reporting, students who are not as comfortable speaking in public have a much harder time demonstrating what they really know. Some of my AP students are working on improving their oral communication skills, so this provides them with an opportunity for additional practice. I have other students who are learning English, and writing is still difficult. It is much easier for them to express their knowledge orally. This feature supports Guideline 4.1, provide varied ways to respond, and Guideline 5.1, provide options for expressive skills and fluency. This example also includes mini demonstration videos so that they can play as they read. These provide my students with options to interact with materials, Guideline 4.2, through video. Some of my students will make meaning from the text, and this example will only support what they have already learned from reading. For other students, this example will make all the difference in their understanding of portions of the text they read. This video will serve as the basis for their understanding and will reinforce the meaning in the text. In addition to the mini demonstration videos, the movement of the iris as different degrees of lights hit it can be repeated over and over again, and thus provides my students with scaffolds for practice and performance, Guideline 5.3. In addition, students who remain challenged in their understanding of how the eye reacts to different degrees of light are also able to activate the demo that takes the iris away from the eye. In this demo, students clearly see that it is the iris alone that responds to the light, not the pupil. The variance in the way the demonstrations provide different levels of practice for my students is valuable. Students who understand the concept from the beginning do not need the different demos. Students who are challenged benefit from the demos. I must admit, the demonstration helped me better understand what was happening when different shades of light hit the eye. I find it difficult to help students develop executive function skills. Many students have difficulty monitoring their own progress and staying on task. In this example, when students complete a question, it is automatically checked off. This would help many of my students who have organizational difficulties to remember what they have and have not completed, and facilitates their independent management of information, Guideline 6.3, and enhances their capacity for monitoring progress, Guideline 6.4. And finally, let me see how I can support the affective network of my students in this I lesson. To do this, I'll look at Principle 3, provide multiple means of engagement. Students have many choices. They can record or type their response. They can change the color of the iris, Guideline 7.1, increase individual choice and autonomy. Some of my students will change it to the color of their girlfriend or boyfriend, and that alone will get them interested. Guideline 7.2, enhance relevance, value, and authenticity. Also the fact that the pages are set out so clearly, it reduces distractions. Guideline 7.3, reduce threats and distractions. In the textbook, there are so many images with captions, and some of my students don't know where to look or what is important on the page. Because this example is digital, it has many options that can help students persist. First, as I already mentioned, the text can be read aloud to support struggling readers or English language learners. The built-in glossary supports background knowledge and comprehension. All of these are examples of how to support Guideline 8.2, varied levels of support and challenge. Some of my students become overwhelmed when they get to the end of the chapter questions and see how many there are. This example asks them only to respond to one question per page, which provides a scaffold for their coping skills and decreases their anxiety. Guideline 9.2, Scaffold Coping Skills and Strategies. Wow! I think using the I example as a part of my lesson will greatly maximize learning for all my students. It certainly has multiple means of representation, action and expression, and engagement, and consequently supports the three learning networks: knowledge, strategic, and affective. I also learned two important points doing this. First, my lesson does not need to address each UDL bullet on the checklist. If I met several under each principle, my lesson will support many more students. Second, if I apply the UDL principles as I design and develop lessons, more of my students will benefit right from the start, and I won't have to redesign lessons.